Hey everybody, I'm Debbie of MadameStitch, and in this video I'm going to show you how to seam squares together using the slip stitch method on the right side of the fabric. So when we do a slip stitch seam on the right side of the fabric, we're going to hold the squares together with the wrong sides together. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. So you'll notice the top one is right side out. The bottom one is right side the other direction. So we have the wrong side and the wrong side held together. How do you tell? Generally, the stitches will slant toward you on the right side of the fabric. On the wrong side, they will slant away from you. I'm going to turn it around this way. When I do a slip stitch seam, I typically will use a hook size larger than the one that I used for the squares or the blanket or whatever I'm seaming. In this case, for these squares, I used a size H. So I used a size H for the seam. I'm going to use a size I, a 5.5 millimeter, because it keeps my slip stitch from being too tight. Now, when I work, I'm using a contrast color here, if I can find the end. I'm using a contrast color for the seam so that you can see where the seam is. Normally, I would do this in the same color as the squares, but in some blankets, I have been known to use a contrasting color because this is a great way to add a design element to your blanket. Okay, so to start, I'm going to find the middle stitch of this of the corner. That one was easy to find. This one is here. And I'm going to attach my yarn through both loops. Oops. Get back in there. All right. And I just use a simple knot to attach it. You can also use a slip knot or whichever you like to do this with. All right. So the first thing I do is I'm going to put my hook through both of those loops and pull up a loop. This gets me started. And basically, I'm just going to insert my hook in the top loop. Actually, it's the back loop only. So the top loop here and the top loop here, and do a slip stitch through all three loops. Let me show you that again. So that's the back loop only. This is the back loop only facing away from you. 3 loops on my hook, and I'm going to slip stitch by pulling that through all of them. You can see already I'm starting to get a slip stitch that sits on the top of the fabric. I just do that across in each stitch, just being careful that I don't pull those loops too tightly, otherwise I'm going to get a puckered seam. All right, I'm going to do that across and meet you at the other end of the top of the square. All right, I've worked my way along the edge of the square and I'm at the corner. I always work into the corner stitch. I think I went one too far. Let's do it this way. I'll go back and just make sure that I work the last stitch in the middle stitch of the corner. I've worked 3 single crochets in the corner here. This is the corner stitch here. This is the corner stitch here. The reason I go into that middle stitch is because when I come back around or I'm doing the vertical seam, I create a closed it's closed here instead of having a hole. If I don't work that far out, I end up with a hole that I have to stitch closed, so I don't want to do that. All right, I want to show you what it looks like now that I'm finished. So remember, this was worked on the right side with the wrong sides of the squares together, and we're working the slip stitch seam on the right side. So if I take that open, you'll see that it creates a little bit of a ridge along the seam. Now, if you don't want that to poke up, you can certainly block that and work it flat, but it does create that nice decorative ridge along the front side or the right side of the squares. If I turn it over, this is what it looks like on the back side. It's completely invisible, right? So you need to choose before you start doing your slip stitch seam whether you want it to be invisible or whether you want it to be decorative. So this version is with the right sides held together. The wrong sides held together with the slip stitch seam worked on the right sides of the squares. In the next part of this video, I'm going to show you what it looks like if I do the same thing, but on the wrong side of the squares with the right sides held together. I know it gets confusing when we talk about it, but remember, this is on the right side of the fabric. We're going to get to the wrong side in the next portion. Okay, in this portion, I'm going to show you what it looks like if I work that slip stitch seam on the wrong side or back side of the squares. For this one, I need to have the right sides facing each other. And remember, you can tell what's the right side, either if there's texture on the front side or by the final round where the stitches slant toward the right side. Slant toward the right side. So these are right sides held together. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing I did in the last part of the video where I insert my hook in through the middle stitch of the corner, which is here. Pull that yarn through, and I just make a simple knot, which I can weave in easily when I'm finished. So to start, insert your hook where that yarn is attached, through the stitches where the yarn is attached. Pull up a loop, that gets you started. And again, we're just going to go, these are the back loops, so this time the back loop is facing me, the back loop is away from me on the other square. So I go into this loop, and into this loop, and I slip stitch. Same thing here. And I'm basically just going to do that in every stitch across. So I'm going to finish up this seam for you, and I'll meet you at the very end so you can see what it looks like to work the slip stitch seam on the wrong sides of the squares. Alrighty, I have made it to the other side of the square. Make sure that when you get there, again, you want to put the last stitch in the middle stitch of the corner on both squares. That way you prevent a hole when you come along for the next pass. Once I do that, I would fasten off, or I would continue adding squares as I go across my blanket. But let me show you what it looks like. So this is a slip stitch seam on the wrong side of the squares, and you'll notice this time that the ridge is on the wrong side, right? So you can see it very clearly there, but if I turn this over, on the front side, you have an invisible seam. Now I can work these. Notice it's bleeding through just a little bit, but that's because I used a different color. If I don't want this to show on the right side of the fabric, I'm definitely going to work that seam with the same color as the squares, and then all of that you see white that's showing through is hidden. And this is a great way, if you've got a lot of squares to join together, this is a great way to join them so that you don't have to use a long piece of thread that's going to get tangled as you work through those squares over and over. This way you can crochet directly from the skein and not have to worry about running out of yarn before you finish up a row of squares. So this is working the slip stitch seam on the wrong side of the squares. Remember, rewind to the beginning to see what it looks like to crochet a slip stitch seam on the right side.